Millennials, you're about to experience your Pluto square. This is going to be a transformative and revelatory period in your life where you're going to come face to face with hidden truths and the realities of power. Yes, Pluto is about to move into Aquarius where it will square your natal Scorpio Plutos. And Pluto in Aquarius will be the period when the baby boomer generation finally hands over the reins of power to younger cohorts, and it's about to begin. In this episode, I'm joined by another special guest. She's a brilliant astrologer and writer. She's Steph Koyfman, aka Lady Kazemi. And we're going to unpack the meaning of the Pluto square so that those of you who are about to experience it will know what to expect. And those of you who aren't will know what you're looking at.
So the Pluto square, which is when transiting Pluto makes its first square or 90-degree aspect to where Pluto sits in your birth chart, is one of the defining initiations into middle age for people alive currently. And I say people alive currently because Pluto has an elliptical orbit, so it can actually spend anywhere from 11 to 31 years in one sign. That makes the Pluto square relatively unique as a coming of age transit in the sense that not every generation experiences it at the same age, assuming they live to experience it at all. So for instance, someone who was born when Pluto entered Taurus in 1853 wouldn't have a Pluto square until they reached the age of 84. And that actually vastly exceeds the average life expectancy of that time. Other generations, like Gen X, for example, might experience a Pluto square as young as 36.
The question of where the boundaries of these different generations lies is one without definite answers. But we're astrologers, so we're going to take the definition of millennials as the Pluto in Scorpio generation. That means if you were born between 1985 and 1994, you definitely have Pluto in Scorpio in your natal chart. And if you're born in 1983, 1984, or 1995, you may well have it as well.
For millennials, the Pluto square will arrive at some point during Pluto's transit through Aquarius, which will last for the next 20 years. So the oldest millennials, they're about to have their Pluto square right now at age 40, and the youngest will have theirs around age 47.
Pluto was the Greek and Roman god of the underworld, a fearsome power hidden from view underneath the earth. So in astrology, Pluto has a lot to do with the hidden and its revelation, with themes of power, manipulation, control, and journeys to the underworld.
In her book, Midlife is Not a Crisis, Virginia Bell writes, Pluto's arrival signals that we are ready to deal with something that we couldn't handle before. We must make our own journey into the underworld or the unconscious to reclaim those buried parts of ourselves. It is a kind of soul retrieval, a dark night of the soul, or in the words of poet T.S. Eliot, a condition of complete simplicity costing not less than everything.
So when Pluto enters Scorpio, it will square its natal position. Squares are dynamic aspects which have to do with action, friction, and conflict.
So in general, Pluto's job is to expose things that don't want to be exposed and to reveal things about our relationship to power. Often the Pluto square can have both internal and external manifestations where on the one hand, it's about confronting some of your worst fears, cauterizing your deepest wounds, and processing some of the shame that you weren't able to deal with in your youth. On the other hand, the Pluto square can also be a time when you're forced to occupy the bully pulpit or engage in what might feel like the final boss of all power struggles. So in this sense, it's sort of like the ultimate loss of innocence. At the end of this transit, you're more aware of your own psychological shadow, you're more aware of what needs to change in your life, and you've also perhaps come to know what it means to deal with a shady adversary or a system that is willing to play dirty, is willing to abuse its power in order to maintain it, and is not interested in ceding any ground to anyone. For some people, Pluto square could look like running for office for the first time and having to learn the dirty games that people play in politics. For others, it could simply be a gradual emergence of feelings that you've been repressing for a while, or a sense that certain elements of your life are toxic or not contributing to your happiness, and that it's now up to you to sort of excise the rot. In Planets in Transit, Robert Hand says the Pluto square signifies a period of general regeneration, which may not be entirely pleasant. He writes, most of us are attached to the past, whether or not it is good for us. And this transit will root out precisely those elements of the past that are not good for you, even those aspects that you have forgotten about. What's especially interesting to me about the millennial version of this is that, and I acknowledge that this might be sort of a US-centric or predominantly Western take, but I think of Pluto and Scorpio as the therapy generation. We are often, if not usually, the first ones in our recent family lineages to go to therapy or even just develop an interest in processing generational trauma. It's really Pluto and Scorpio of us to want to dig those skeletons out of the closet, to leave no psychological stone unturned in the pursuit of the whole ugly mess see truth, to, want to see the darkness, but also metabolize it so you and your children can move beyond it. So I think it'll be interesting to see what it means to expose what doesn't want to be exposed in a generation of people who are typically already very fluent in the process of deep inner work and introspection.
Now, if you're enjoying this video, please do give it a like. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, why not hit the subscribe button and make sure you don't miss any more of this content. You're the best. So because of the way that Pluto moves, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it's going to make several exact hits of that Pluto square for all of you. This will be a process, not a specific moment in time. And if you look through popular culture and history, it's easy to find striking examples of how Pluto squares play out. One of the most dramatic examples I've seen is the life of Henry VIII, he of the 6 wives and the trouble with the Pope. Here's Henry's chart. He was born on the 28th of June, 1491. Pluto was at 29 degrees and 17 minutes of Libra. So what was going on in Henry's life in early 1531 when Pluto reached 29 degrees of Capricorn and closed in on a square with his natal Pluto? Well, Henry was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but the couple had been unable to produce a male heir to inherit the throne. And this was a huge problem for Henry, so he became desperate to divorce Catherine and marry again. And he'd become obsessed with Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies in waiting. And Anne Boleyn had refused to become Henry's mistress. She was aiming for a bigger prize. And when all this was happening, Pluto was in the 5th house of Henry's chart, the house of children and sex. So Henry wanted the Pope in Rome to annul his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne. But the Pope wouldn't allow it. So on February 11th, 1531, just 1 month and less than 1 degree from that exact Pluto square, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. In other words, he severed himself and England from the authority of the Church in Rome. And he promptly took advantage of his new position to marry Anne Boleyn. So we can see here a Pluto square writ large. We see a monumental power struggle, in this case between Henry VIII and the Pope, and it resulted in Henry gaining more power and a new position. Now, if you're interested in learning how the Pluto square could play out for you, both Steph and I are available for natal consultations. I use a variety of modern and traditional techniques to help clients understand where they are in life and where they're going. Details in the description below. And you can find Steph at Lady Kazemi on both Instagram and Twitter, as well as at ladykazemi.com. She's currently seeing clients for both natal and year-ahead consultations, as well as offering general astrological guidance that meets you where you are. So what's also important to note about this Pluto square is it will also be the time of the Pluto opposition for the Pluto in Leo generation. This is the generation born between 1937 and 1958, who tend to get referred to as the baby boomers now. So as Pluto moves through Aquarius, squaring its natal position for millennials, it will be opposing its natal position for boomers.
Even if not everyone is individually locked into a power struggle with their parents, I think it's very possible that culturally this could reflect millennials unseating the boomer generation from the mantle of power and enthroning a new set of values and cultural norms. Here in the US, the word gerontocracy has been thrown around to describe an aging government run by boomers who are seemingly holding on to power. One of the celebrity examples I always bring up with clients who are experiencing a Pluto square is Britney Spears. Britney has Pluto in the 1st house of self, and transiting Pluto has been going through her 4th house of family, lineage, and parents since 2008, which is the same year she entered into a conservatorship with her father that gave him complete control over her career, her assets, and her personal life.
Jamie Spears, her father, was given legal control over his daughter's personal, professional, and financial affairs in 2008. After she suffered a mental breakdown and had 2 hospitalizations.
So the Pluto square actually perfected for Britney, or became exact, in 2021, which is the year the conservatorship was finally terminated after a long court battle. In the year or so leading up to that moment, the Free Britney movement started to gain momentum after Britney herself publicly acknowledged the truth of what her fans were saying and finally explicitly stated her desire to end what she called an abusive conservatorship and began revealing details that were previously concealed about the degree of control that her father was exerting over her.
Free Britney is a reality at last.
So this period is likely to signify the handing over of the reins of power from that older generation to younger people, including the Pluto and Scorpio generation. There's another power struggle currently underway within the British royal family.
Meghan Markle's Pluto square also involved a familial power struggle, but this time with her in-laws, and especially with the pressures and public scrutiny that came with being part of their family as a Black woman. Meghan has Pluto in her 4th house of home and family, and transiting Pluto is in her 7th house of marriage and relationships. The square first went exact in the spring of 2018, which was actually when Meghan and Harry got married. During the last exact hit in the fall of 2019, Harry and Meghan announced that they were taking a 6-week break from public life, which, as we all know by now, was soon followed by their decision to step back from their royal duties permanently and achieve financial independence on their own. So I don't want to freak people out with those examples, because I think we can all agree these are both extreme and somewhat unusual situations, but they both convey the symbolism so vividly. I know from personal experience and from talking to friends who have had major Pluto transits that it tends to begin with a bit of a tower moment, if we're sort of leaning on tarot symbolism, but depending on the context of other transits and what's going on in your life, sometimes you leave stronger and more empowered and more firm in who you are as a person.
Now, to get a better idea of what's coming for you in this decade, I suggest you also watch this video in which I discuss the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the early 90s, which a lot of you also have in your natal charts. This cycle is about to lead to its sextile phase, which will lead to a blooming of many of the things that were born at the time of the conjunction, including you.